let's take a few minutes to talk about inclusive education as a human rights issue. The goals of this presentation today are to understand the inclusive education concept as outlined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We're actually going to look at inclusive education implementation in China and India for insights on how governments have to redress themselves in order to meet the needs of individuals with disabilities. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities document actually represents the UN's shift from a medical model to a social model of disability. The medical model, you may be aware of, views a person's limitations as inherent, excluding the person from society. It's following what happens when you go to the doctor. You go in because you have an ailment, the doctor looks at you and decides what needs to be done to treat your ailment, and then he sends you away. That happens in education in line with a medical model when educators see the disability of a person before they see the person, and consequently they develop a plan of education based on the disability rather than basing it upon the person and the person's ability. The social model, or the social/human rights model, actually recognizes the basic human rights of people with disabilities. It really is designed to make it clear that society is the one that constructs a disability. People don't necessarily. They may have an ability, they may have a different kind of ability, but society is the one that constructs the impairments that make it difficult for people with disabilities to survive in our context. However, it must be noted that early efforts as early as the 1990s, when the Convention on the Rights of the Child came about, that the rights of the child was really a move towards a social model, wherein the idea was that we were going to require states to provide basic education to children with disabilities. This was a new paradigm, and that paradigm continued during the Salamanca framework, which also reiterates the rights of every child to an education and calls on governments not just to make sure the kids had a right to education, but governments needed to actually make room for access and accommodation of students with disabilities in regular schools. The United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities actually was designed to clarify all the many documents and conventions that had happened previously: the Salamanca, the Dakar, the one that I just mentioned, the rights of the child. All those pieces needed to come together. So this new iteration is designed just to give clarification and to strengthen the rights of students and children and persons relative to their disabilities. Now, it's so funny because the articles in this particular document address many facets of life. The issue of accessibility, making sure that students and people have access to buildings, spaces, society, and community, that there's room for personal mobility, health, employment, and participation in political life. And not last but not least, education. So the whole goal here is to promote and protect and ensure that equal rights are really important, and that people deserve that as a freedom as a person with a disability. So let's give our attention specifically to the issue of education. That's what we're here for. The notions of education under this particular convention actually are designed to recognize the rights of persons with disabilities to an education and to require states to realize their rights through inclusive education. Actually, another component is that it's important that we have to give consideration to this. Recognizing that people have a right to education is different from giving them the access to an education. So one of the problems here is that in most countries, the act of giving people or ensuring people with disabilities a right to free and public education is challenged by the curricula that teachers put in place or schools put in place, the buildings that education is held in, whether the buildings are accessible or not, whether there's the curricula may be rigid in that a child who is blind will not be able to see the books or read the text or respond to things that are written on the board. A child who has a hearing impairment will not be able to, without the supports that are necessary, may not be able to participate in the curriculum aptly. A child with a learning disability may need some other kind of supports. A kid with autism may need a communication device, but if that's not available, then the student is not able to participate in the curriculum that sits before him. So the curriculum can be rigid, the building can be inaccessible, and even the teacher training that prepares the teachers may not have all the pieces that are necessary. So what is inclusive education? It's just the opposite of segregated education. Segregated education puts students in special schools, special locations, away from the mainstream of society. Segregated into homes, into special regions of the country, whatever. Whenever students are separated from their typically developing peers, they are segregated. Inclusive education is sought to get away from or move away from that separation or segregation, and it's trying to it's designed to try to make efforts to ensure that students have access to society, to school, to work, to community, and actually an opportunity or a chance to improve their academic performance. So the features of inclusive education as outlined in Article 24 of the UNCRPD deal with these 5 issues: refraining from excluding persons from general education on the basis of disability, ensuring equal access to a free and quality education, providing reasonable accommodations of students, and supporting students to facilitate effective education, and then lastly, providing effective individualized support measures. Being able to give them a way, if you're giving them a way to be measured, or using an assessment system that works towards students' strengths rather than to their weaknesses. So, non-discriminatory access to regular education, reasonable accommodation for students with disabilities, and individualized supports. These are like really, really important. Cannot allow students to sit at home and not have access to school, or let money or the building itself get in the way of whether or not a student can get into a school setting. The accommodations need to be put in place so that so that when students come in, the school is welcoming and inviting. The curriculum needs to be open and barrier-free, and the school building itself needs to take away physical barriers that infringe upon students' access to the curriculum and to the school environment. And we need to make sure that there's room for addressing students' interests, abilities, personalities, characteristics. All those things have to be acknowledged, that people are different. We all learn differently. We all think differently. And room must be made in a child-centered approach to include all learners. So when we look at what goes on, what has happened in India as of 2008, now of course there could be an update that I'm not aware of, but we've come to find out, according to Hernandez, India and China together are responsible for 26 million children with disabilities, and they have adopted laws which encourage students with disabilities to participate in schools. Right now, as of 2008, China has 60% of its children with disabilities enrolled in school, and India had 40% of its children. But there are some specific changes that are necessary in order to make sure that those children have access to inclusive education. In China, it really becomes important for them to revise and amend their existing laws and move to clear away the medical model in the language of the law and the Constitution toward a social model. For instance, the Chinese Constitution connects education to charitable assistance, which is more of a medical model, but the move is necessary to make sure that students are given by requirement of the law access to inclusive education, which is not in place right now. None of the laws require students to have access to inclusive education. And the same is true with India. Although India has developed an action plan for inclusive education, it has not been ratified into law, and their constitution requires a provision of free and compensatory education, but for kids between 6 and 14, however, the laws do not require inclusive education, and if they were to incorporate or make law the action plan they have established, then children in their country will have a better chance. Not only is there a need for a legal change or legislative change, but there's a need for funding, a change in the way teachers are recruited and even trained in order to make sure that an inclusive education system actually works. So I just want to give you a chance to think back now, based on what we've talked about here about India and China. I'd like for you to think about your country. What's the rough estimate of the numbers of students with disabilities in your country? Are they available? Is the education of persons with disabilities inclusive or segregated? And what are the primary features of inclusive education that you have observed in your community? Finally, in what way is the Constitution of your country consistent or inconsistent with the inclusive education provisions in Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? Now, I've placed in here the slides and to which these questions are referring as reference points for you to look back. I encourage you to go to the discussion board and answer these questions in the space provided, and I look forward to the discussion relative to this topic. Thanks.